Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy, and I'm here with Cedric de Leon, who is a professor of sociology at UMass Amherst. He is a political sociologist who studies political parties and the labor movement. He is the author of The Origins of Right to Work, Anti-Labor Democracy in the 19th Century, which was published in 2015. He's the author of Crisis, When Political Parties Lose the Consent to Rule, published in 2019. And the topic of our discussion today, which is Freedom Train, Black Politics, and the Story of Interracial Labor Solidarity, published with University of California Press this year, 2025. Cedric, welcome to the Center for Work and Democracy again.
Yeah.
A couple times.
Thanks, Michael.
So why don't we just start with an orienting question,
Sure.
which is why you felt that this book in particular was necessary.
Right. I think that the main reason is that the story that we tell ourselves about how the labor movement became a multiracial movement is that we had a few visionaries who were kind of crack organizers in the Communist Party and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. We had visionary leadership from folks like Phil Murray and John L. Lewis, and that these folks basically took a strategic viewpoint of organizing the American political economy at that time, and it meant organizing black workers into the labor movement. And what I was sort of dissatisfied about, with respect to that account, is that all of the stories were about white people. They were about white workers. They were about white trade union leaders. And I asked myself, surely, black folks benefited from being members of unions. Where were they? Who were they? What did they achieve? What organizations did they establish? And so as I looked into the archive and interacted with people just to make sure that I was getting the scholarship correct, it became clear to me that this story really had not been told. There have been really important works on sort of local struggles to desegregate American unions. Robin Kelly, Korstadt, Michael Honey, there are several of those. Mm-hmm. But we hadn't yet seen a book about a kind of effort to nationalize that struggle by building mass organizations to desegregate American unions. That's the story that I thought had yet to be told, and that's why I wrote the book.
So, when you say that, we do have a narrative about the CIO as being playing a very important role in the institutionalization of an anti-racist ideology.
Right.
Right. And that also carries over a little bit from the IWW,
right.
which also it gets situated in that stream, usually in opposition to the AFL.
Right.
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 And so there is this proposed heroic tale
mm-hmm.
of anti-racism in the newer unions, in the more in the unions that are more heavily influenced by communism or syndicalism,
right?
Things like that, and so part of what you're saying is I'm filling in a lot of blanks here, mm-hmm. but you're also situating yourself to say those heroic tales are wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily wrong because there's no anti-racism in these institutions. So why don't you
right.
tell us why you think that they are wrong?
Right. Well, okay. So let's. Let's talk about the AFL and let's talk about the CIO.
Okay.
So the AFL is often vilified, right, yeah. for being this sort of like exclusionary house of labor, primarily a trade union federation that was not interested in organizing industrial workers, and because white folks basically dominated the trades and excluded black people from the trades, that there is no story here of anti-racism, and certainly that is borne out in the book. Mm-hmm. However, one story that is not told with respect to the AFL is the history of the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right, which was led by possibly the most famous black trade unionist of all, A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was a key leader in the American Federation of Labor, even before the merger with the CIO. It was not a straightforward sort of relationship of anti-racism for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, for sure. It took a very long time for A. Philip Randolph to persuade the AFL leadership to charter the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters as an international affiliate, but they eventually did. And so when the story of anti-racism sort of, first of all, just puts to the side the institutional history of the American Federation of Labor, what ends up happening is that we lose the whole story of the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which, in my view, is possibly the most important black-led union in American labor history. That seems like quite an oversight to me. So that's one thing. Let's talk about the CIO. So, as I said, you have stories about communist cadres on the ground who have a very progressive vision of international class solidarity, and of course, black people must figure into that struggle, and that's why they organize black people. You also have this sort of story about John L. Lewis understanding that that the American political economy centered on steel and all the adjunct industries like auto that fed off of steel, and that if we could only organize steel and possibly threaten a crisis in the American economic system, then we would be able to bring the employer class to their knees and actually create real, meaningful social transformation, right? And dramatically increase the standard of living of working class people in this country. Okay, so the issue with that story, right, is that they did not come up with that strategy on their own. John P. Davis, who was the national director of the National Negro Congress, approached Phil Murray, Van Bittner, and all the kind of like key leaders, right, the heroes of the SWOC, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and said, listen, you want to organize steel? That's great. How are you going to organize black people? Because just a few years ago, during the steel strikes, the bosses pit white people against black people, and essentially the strike was destroyed. Do you have a plan? Because let me tell you, I have a plan. What I would like you to do is have me handpick some rank and file black workers to come onto staff, and we will organize the steel industry for you. And Van Bittner and Phil Murray said, okay, let's do that. Why don't you go ahead and pick some of the best folks that you know in the Great Lakes area, and let's start with the Chicago and Gary steel corridor. And those folks, through their networks within the African American community, were able to organize steel workers. I mean, it was like wildfire. In a matter of 2 years, they had organized over 100 local unions. I mean, that's unheard of. Today, I mean, if we think about the auto drives in the South, for example, there are multi-year projects. These people are organizing, right, for fractions of workers. What we're talking about here is 3 black staff organizers working through their networks, doing the one-on-one organizing, the hardcore kind of like the building blocks, right, of proper organizing, and organizing tens of thousands of workers at a clip. Okay? And so that story is never told. Hardly anybody knows about the National Negro Congress, right? And they were absolutely vital to organizing not just steel, but auto. The National Negro Congress was able to take down the most resistant and hostile employer in the auto industry, which was the Ford Motor Company. Okay, the National Negro Congress took down Ford.
Yeah.
Okay, it was not the Ruther brothers; it was the National Negro Congress. They organized the tobacco industry in the South, and they organized the packing house workers. All industries that were menial, just the dirtiest possible work that you could find. That's where black people were disproportionately concentrated, and those were the people that the National Negro Congress organized. And by the way, the CIO, to their credit, accepted the help.
Yeah.
But it was not their strategy. It was not their plan. And without the NNC, we can't ever know now because history happened the way that it happened. But without them, I doubt that they would have made inroads, made the inroads that they did in those particular industries. And by the way, if John L. Lewis was right, then the NNC's organizing project in Chicago and Gary then spread, right? And so from there it went to Pittsburgh, and then to Birmingham, and that's how the USW was really formed, in the 1930s. It wasn't only them, of course, but they were a vital piece because they took away, right, the race baiting tactic of the boss, which had been their most reliable tactic for defeating the working class in that industry.
When I'm reading this, and your account of the NNC is convincing. Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me was I didn't feel like you had to go very far to reveal the role of the NNC.
Right.
This is right in letters of leaders.
Right.
It's in, convention documents, proceedings, letters about those things. And that makes me ask a whole host of questions because it's not like nobody's ever studied the CIO. Right.
That's right.
And it's not like we don't have accounts. We have a lot of hagiographic accounts.
Sure.
The heroic Ruther, the heroic Hillman, or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
And then we have some institutional accounts, organizational accounts, right? And then some like Stott and Lynn sort of the workers are the heroes kind of accounts.
Yeah.
But it immediately brings into focus a question of vision in scholarship. If you're not like E.P. Thompson, who's doing an anthropological interpretation of court records from the 18th century to get where you're going.
Right.
Why are all these other scholars looking at a lot of the same material, not seeing the role that you're seeing?
Well, I think that they're actually not looking at the same material.
Okay.
They are looking at material that I don't know. I don't know the intentionality or the subjectivity of these authors, but I imagine there's a story about the CIO that becomes like accepted. And the most far out and groovy part of that story is the Communist Party, and so they go where they think they'll find the archival data that not just confirms. I don't want to caricature these people, but that tells the story about that particular dimension of the CIO.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if they want to do Hillman and the ILG, they'll do that. Yeah. If they want to talk about the mine workers and John L. Lewis, they'll look for that data. But to your point, the data is readily available. All I did, I didn't have to consult 19th century court records and dig. I did sort of like a treasure trove of Luddite, archival material from back in the days. All I did was I got on a train. I went to the Schomburg Center for Research, in Black culture in Harlem. I mean, I would wake up at 6 and I would be at my seat in the Schomburg at 10 a.m. And they have the entire record of the National Negro Congress there. I mean, it's boxes and boxes of stuff. And if anybody had bothered to go to the Schomburg to look at the data, they would have found it because it's readily available. What I'm saying is, I guess my answer to your question is, if they wanted to reveal the central role of black workers in desegregating the labor movement, they would have needed to look at other sources. But they looked at the same sources that other people look at.
See, I actually think that's a little generous.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do, because it's not just a question of looking for the organizations, because you're
Okay.
talking about the organization of steel,
Yeah.
right, and the narrative
Right.
we have around that.
Yeah.
The organization of Ford, which was always the toughest nut to crack in auto.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then the tobacco story, I mean, we have a whole narrative of Operation Dixie, which is
Sure.
you go south, you get killed.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
If you want to be organizing labor. And a few years before, you have this amazing account of organizing
Right.
tobacco workers.
Right.
So, in a way, it's, so if you want to understand these things and the NNC isn't appearing, playing a significant role in your account,
Yeah.
it makes me really question, the scholarship of a lot of preceding people, because it seems like it has to be a studied ignoring of some of this stuff. And there are all kinds of good, well, not good, but plausible reasons why. Like these stories are complicated enough. Once I introduce the axis of race,
Right.
my book doubles in length, or
Right.
I don't want to go there for some other reason,
Sure.
or whatever
Sure.
else.
Sure. Yeah.
But when I'm reflecting on what you're writing, one of the interesting things to me is that it actually changes the narratives of a whole bunch of these stories. And like Operation Dixie, the way that we tell that story, I think is really significant for how we understand labor history.
Right.
The main takeaway is disproven by what
Right.
the NNC was doing just a few years before. You can organize the
Right.
South.
Yeah, of course you can organize the South. Yeah. The most famous story that we tell ourselves, for those of us who are in the labor movement, who are organizers and labor educators now, is that Operation Dixie was a failure. Yeah. That basically there was no way to break the South. Jim Crow, white supremacy was just far too strong here to build a kind of culture of interracial class solidarity. And that's not really true. Part of the reason why Operation Dixie failed, and for those watching who don't know what it is, it was a kind of institutional kind of project on the part of the CIO to organize the South, but the internal accounts of Operation Dixie were that the primarily white staff that went down there to organize the South were basically accepting segregated unions, and there were people in the CIO, black activists and workers, who were screaming about this. This is like you are basically feeding into, you are enabling the primary tactic of the bosses to divide the workers in these workplaces. That's not how you organize the South. You actually have to do the exact opposite, right? And so what the NNC does, first in Richmond, Virginia, but then later on in North Carolina, is they start. Well, actually, the workers, the black workers, primarily black women, actually in the tobacco workforce, they begin organizing themselves. They organized black women organized the first sit-down strike ever in the state of Virginia. So what ends up happening is that somebody basically was a leader among the workforce, basically said, we're going to stop working. And then the henchmen of the boss come in and they try to sort of like repress the movement, and a black male coworker stands up for the women, and then he dies of a heart attack on the spot. And at that point, everybody just goes crazy. They sit down on the job. The white workers actually join the black workers. They all walk out, right? And in a matter of a month, we were just talking earlier about how long it takes to organize an auto plant today. in 1 month, they organized 4 locals. In Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy.
Right.
And what is important to understand about that story, right, is that white workers accepted the leadership of black workers in that moment because they knew what it was to be exploited and treated like crap by these tobacco barons. They knew what it was. You know, they may have enjoyed slightly better working conditions because, they were in a different part of the plant. I mean, they were in the processing part of the plant, as opposed to the black workers who were like really handling the leaves, right? Like the dirty work, right?
Yeah.
But I think that the part of the reason why Operation Dixie does not work is because they were too afraid to let the workers basically run the show,
Yeah.
right? And I think what the tobacco industry shows, under conditions of massive repression and entrenched white supremacy, is that, when the chips are down and it's ready to fight, we're ready to fight the boss, we let the workers lead that project, they'll figure it out. I mean, and this is part of the genius, I think, of a sort of like anarcho-syndicalist kind of like political vision, right? Yeah. All of us up here who are just like experts in the labor movement think that we're just going to come on down and like fix the whole damn thing. And if you want to organize millions of workers, which we have to do, I mean, I'm jumping forward in time right now, right? We have around 140 million unorganized workers in this country right now. Even 2,000 staff organizers is not going to organize 140 million people. The only way that 140 million people, the only time actually in American history when millions and millions of workers organized at a clip, right, was when it was driven by worker self-activity, right? I think the tobacco workers show that. And I think going back to the historiography piece, right, is like, if the story that we want to tell has to do with figuring out why Sidney Hillman was a mensch or why John L. Lewis was such a damn visionary, you're not going to find that. That's just not the data you're going to find. You're going to find Sidney Hillman grew up in this neighborhood and then he did this and this was his grandmother. I'm like, okay, I mean, if that's what you want to tell, that's fine. But if you want to actually know how the workers organized, like that, 4 locals in a month, if you want to know how that happens in the South, then you have to look someplace else.
Yeah, I mean, I kept running into that in various places. I'm like, just by revealing that vein that's so important in understanding these dynamics, as you're carrying the story forward, I'm like, oh, okay, well, this changes the narrative of that event and that event. I mean, even the way you described what was happening in Virginia, the woman holding up the sign that says strike in the middle of, okay. I mean, this is Norma Ray. Sally Field is white.
That's right.
And,
that's right.
Is that intentional?
Well, I don't know. It's just how it happened.
Yeah.
But I couldn't help but think.
Norma Ray.
Yeah. No, so the woman who starts the tobacco strike basically holds up a sign, right? And in sort of like the popular imagination, that's Sally Field, a white lady holding up the sign, but it was actually a black woman holding up that sign.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
And I should note, one of the things which becomes transparently clear, especially in this era of the NNC and then NNLC, is the extremely prominent role of women in leading these organizations.
Yes.
And really pushing this very specific agenda around empowering black people at the same time as you're empowering workers. So,
yes.
And partially just telling the biographies of these women seems like a very overlooked and somewhat distressingly overlooked part of the story.
Yes, definitely.
And you do make a point in the very beginning that this is one of the lessons of this book. Right? We'll talk about some of the others as we move.
Sure. Yeah.
So before we move on, I just want to note for everybody who is with us today that we will be taking questions from all of you in a little while. So if you have questions for Cedric, please put them in the chat, and in a little while we'll be getting to those questions as well. Thanks. All right. So let's move on a little bit. I feel like we could unpack any number of the sort of conventional narratives around these things and the way that you shift the vision. But one of the key points that you want to make is about what you call black politics. Now,
Right.
obviously that could refer to all-encompassing, it's black people engaged in politics, but that's not what
Sure.
you mean. So
Right.
first, why don't we just start with what do you mean by this? And then we can move on to like what does that conceptualization enable you to see and get a hold of?
Yeah, by black politics, what I mean is that black people are not a monolith. Surprise, surprise. They're not all the same people just because they have the same color skin, right? The fact is that black civil society in this period, and the black labor movement in particular, is riven by factional politics. And that's what I'm referring to. I'm referring primarily to this sort of centrist faction that was led by A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who were much more comfortable than their left counterparts in dealing with the bureaucracy of organized labor. They were happy to walk the halls of power, to be members of the executive committee of the AFL, and to try and desegregate the labor movement from within. That was it was not their only tactic, but it was, for much of the centrist faction's history, that was primarily what they were trying to do. They oriented to the United States, and at least outwardly, they were critical of capital only insofar as they excluded black people from the labor market and unions. The left faction, which was led by successive cadres, many of them card-carrying Communist Party members, was very different. They were internationalist in orientation. They were part of the international communist movement. Some of them held anti-colonial and black nationalist politics. And they saw capitalism as a fundamentally exploitative, colonial, and racist formation. And they did not want to walk those halls of power. Yeah. And they, for a lot of their history, were super suspicious of A. Philip Randolph's confidence in organized labor's capacity.
And sometimes for good reasons, because A. Philip Randolph's confidence is not, it doesn't pay off at a number of points.
At a number of points, yes. So, and that is, in a way, that right there is the sort of crux of the division in black politics, in the black independent black labor movement. It is A. Philip Randolph's consistent faith and confidence that with direct action and conversation and cajoling inside the labor movement, they could get the powers that be to relent and open up the membership of the movement to black people. And the left's consistent analysis that the only reason why that would ever happen is if we built power on the ground and we forced these guys to basically transform the labor movement into something that it's not now. That's the only way that it's going to happen. And so that was, the thing is that they were all organized around this strategic objective of desegregating the labor movement. But the sort of political rift was in large part about how we're going to get there, right? So,
One of the things, I mean, again, in terms of narratives,
Yeah.
right? I mean, one of the compelling things about what you're doing is you're pulling on a thread that really originates for this story in the Harlem Renaissance,
Yes, that's right.
which often gets discussed as more of a cultural phenomenon
Yeah.
than a political phenomenon. Even to the extent it's a political phenomenon, it's almost never tied into the history of labor.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So we know there's socialists and there are communists
Right.
and there's all kinds of fascinating thinking going
Absolutely. Yes.
on. And it's a topic that has garnered considerable scholarly attention.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But this story about labor, I can't think of a moment when it gets pulled out. Another book that came out recently, which sort of is really investigating that era, is Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives of Beautiful Experiments, right? Which is very much from the perspective of black women, but
Yeah.
tells the story of some of these black intellectual socialists
Sure.
and things like that on the Harlem scene. And I feel like there's this sort of digging the Harlem Renaissance in a more political or class politics vein and gendered vein.
Yeah.
That is changing the way we're sort of seeing the richness of that intellectual and cultural moment.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little about what you were thinking about that
Sure.
era when you were doing that research?
Yes. Well, I didn't go into studying the Harlem Renaissance because I thought I would find what I eventually did find, which
Yeah.
is this sort of factional rift between the center and the left.
Right.
I began in part trying to piece together A. Philip Randolph's life.
Right.
And I soon realized that, what was going on for him was going on for a lot of black political activists and intellectuals at that time. So, the story about the Harlem Renaissance in this book is that the centrist and left factions actually are born out of Assembly District 21 of the Socialist Party in Harlem.
Yeah.
And once again, the rift comes from the fact that A. Philip Randolph really believes that the Socialist Party has the capacity to address the black labor question and really kind of like advance a project of interracial class solidarity. And the left, who eventually found the Communist Party in Harlem, which is then called the Workers' Party, who believes that this is nonsense. What about the history of the Socialist Party makes you think we're going to get there? So they leave.
Yeah.
And they form something called the African Blood Brotherhood, and which is another Harlem Renaissance political formation. By the way, alongside the UNIA, the Black Nationalist Organization of Marcus Garvey.
Okay.
So there's actually a very kind of like rich political ferment, in Harlem at that time. And of course, as you say, a lot of what we hear about the Harlem Renaissance, that sort of famous, like the iconic picture of the sort of jazz artists, painters, musicians, poets, and so forth in front of the building in Harlem, that's the Harlem Renaissance. The issue with that portrait is that, many of those people, if not most of those people, were part of the left.
Right.
Right? So, we were talking about the National Negro Congress earlier. There was an entire cultural part of the National Negro Congress that was kind of meant to elevate the experience of black working class people, right? Especially during the Second World War, these Harlem artists were kind of pivotal in fighting what these black activists believed was a two-fronted war against fascism, right? We're going to defeat German Nazism and Japanese imperialism abroad, and we're going to defeat Jim Crow unionism at home. It was called the Double V, right? Double Victory program, and these cultural icons of the Harlem Renaissance were primarily left individuals who were writing, doing poetry, painting, sculpting in a way to further that particular struggle against fascism. And so I don't really know why why the Harlem Renaissance is depoliticized in that way. I mean, we are sitting in the United States, in the heart of empire. That doesn't really suit the purposes of the powers that be. But the fact of the matter is that on the ground, I mean, this political factionalism was absolutely vital. I mean, it organized so much. Yeah.
So let's dig in a little bit on black politics because, when we started in the Renaissance, I mean, you're talking about your main characters.
Yeah.
Which lead up into these two branches in the 30s.
Right.
One sort of hard left and one sort of, I guess we call democratic socialist, but identifying as a socialist party, not communist party. And so
right.
But, Garvey is here.
Yes.
I mean, the only, the communists weren't the only ones who thought that, white empire was a problem and was
Right.
not going to accommodate.
Right.
Like, I mean, there are other strains of politics.
Yeah.
There's the black church.
Yes.
There's probably Republican politics. All of these are sort of present.
Right.
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 And so, we can think about black politics as sort of encompassing the positions that black people took.
Right.
But that is not what you mean. You are
Right.
talking about this very specific conflict between it's wrong to call it reformist exactly, but let's call it an institutional path where we can bend institutions like the House of Labor
Yes.
to accommodate black people as
Right.
opposed to those who do not think that, or at least think that you have to start from an autonomous position
Right.
and then force the issue.
Right.
And that sort of animates a lot of the discussion through the whole book. There's sort of
Right.
this persistent contrast
Right.
between these two kind of strains
Right.
of navigating the issue of race and class.
Right.
Right. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about why this becomes the central thing as opposed to all of the other possible, more expansive ways we might think about black politics.
Right.
But then also sort of what you thought that ongoing tension, like why that's so central to the story.
Yeah.
Because
Sure.
a lot of people would tell the story of one strain,
Yeah. Sure.
and the other would be sort of a bit actor that they're reacting to.
Sure.
But you're
sure.
centering both of them.
Yes, I'm centering both the center and the left.
Yeah.
So the sort of, let me just do the preview piece a little bit, right? The whole reason why I look at these two factions is that my view is that it was the back and forth struggle between the center and the left that propelled the struggle for interracial labor solidarity. We don't get to a multiracial labor movement without that back and forth. Right, so that's the kind of main argument about black politics, and I tell both because I think there's no way to explain how we got to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963, which is sort of like the sort of climax of the book, unless we understand that back and forth, and so So I would say that one of the main reasons why I tell the story of both factions is because at different points one is more in the ascendant than the other, and that moment of ascendancy shapes the other faction, which is kind of in a down position at that time, right? So I'll give you an example with the and the other reason why I tell the story through time is because the younger kind of like cadres of older organizations go on to found other independent black labor organizations. So I'm not forcing the story, of this back and forth. It's like people who grew up in one faction go on to found another organization to keep fighting these people.
Part of that's because some of the original ones get wiped out by the other side through the machinations of their competitive positioning, right?
Yes, it's a really very difficult story, and it includes intrigue and betrayal. So I was going to tell another story. I'll tell this story now that it's on my mind. The A. Philip Randolph in the 1950s founds this organization called the Negro Labor Committee USA, which is a anti-communist, red baiting basically agency of the U.S. state and of the mainstream organized labor movement, and the whole reason for existing, by their own admission in internal documents, is to basically destroy the left independent black labor organization, which is the National Negro Labor Council, which was led by Vicki Garvin and Coleman Young and others, right? And it's despicable. I mean, they're like petty tactics, like when the NNLC, the left group, wants to host their founding convention in Cincinnati, the NLC USA and other organizations maneuver and they ensure that none of the hotels will accept them. So there's no place for this convention of hundreds and hundreds of people to stay in Cincinnati. And it also includes, the committee on the House Committee on Un-American Affairs, the sort of infamous HUAC committee, basically, interrogating the members of the NNLC, right? So this is not just, oh, we disagree. We have a situation. We have a situation of intense factionalism, where one faction is literally trying to destroy the other faction.
Right.
So they're not connected because I say they are.
Right.
They're connected because they're trying to kill each other.
Right.
So
their worldviews, they're all living rent free in each other's heads.
That's right, and they and they know each other. And by the way, not only that, but another interesting thing about this story is that despite that sheer animosity, the conflict is real, the betrayal is real. In spite of that, they joined together in coalition twice. Once in the National Negro Congress in the 1930s to organize hundreds of thousands of black industrial workers.
True heroic moment.
True heroic moment. And then again to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, another heroic moment. Yeah. The difference is that with the NNC, the left is in the lead. Even though Randolph is the president, the left really controls the NNC. The NNC is primarily left CIO and CP cadres. The March on Washington is much more centrist in orientation. There are members of hardcore mainstream organized labor in the March on Washington Executive Committee, including, by the way, Walter Reuther.
Right.
Right. So that they're in coalition, but the center is in the ascendant.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if I answered that question clearly enough, but it is truly like it's this epic kind of story between two factions that were born in a local branch of the Socialist Party in Harlem that continue to just fight each other for decades afterwards until at last we get to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So anyway.
So one thing that you described very well is the moment when he's head of NNC, but he realizes he has completely lost the NNC.
Right, exactly.
He chooses to resign.
He chooses to resign, right.
We were talking about this a little bit before we started, but we do have this account of social movements in the way a diversity of organizations can be like let 1,000 flowers bloom. Mm-hmm. Different tactics will emerge, different strategies, messages, meanings, and that's all wonderful. It's all productive. Right. And that seems like a very easy trap to fall into, is to give that kind of account. Right. And you're very much not doing that. These organizations are often competing. Right. They are positioning themselves relative to one another, where the other side is the problem, right, or a problem. Yeah. and so on like that.
Yeah.
And so, just in terms of shifting how we might think about this kind of competitive sectarianism, another account would be that it's just always destructive, right?
Right.
So how would you? Because I don't think either of those quite apply here. So
Right.
how would you actually talk about the relationship between these two in terms of advancing the overall struggle?
Right. Yeah, so I think that I think that it's not always destructive and it's not always constructive. It's constructive when you have a kind of situation of critical solidarity where people are willing to fight with one another internally, but not enroll the state or the boss or other kind of like external actors to the movement to basically destroy the other side.
Yeah.
When that happens, that's when it becomes destructive.
Yeah.
So I would say that, and this is not like my idea, right? So Lipset, Trow, and Coleman wrote a book in 1950 called Union Democracy, in which they tell this story in several hundred pages, by the way, of the International Typographical Union. Yep. And
They've
what
never gotten a glow up like that, the Typographical Union.
That's right. I mean, and what they say is that the reason why the ITU did not descend into oligarchy the way that sociologists like Robert Michels and Max Weber predicted and documented in the Socialist Party, the SPD in Germany, is that they had a working two-party system in the ITU. There was factionalism. It was institutionalized. We're not all meant to just agree with each other all the time. And there isn't like one slate. Like, I mean, if you go to like most any union convention in America, there is one slate. They stand for election. And, you can write in people, but you're not going to beat the slate.
Right.
Right. In the ITU, it wasn't that way. There were two parties in the ITU. Yeah. And so, but always that fight happened internally. There was respect, there were rules, etc. And so in the story that I tell in Freedom Train, when the conflict was stopped at the water's edge, as in for most of the NNC and in the Negro American Labor Council, which eventually organized the March on Washington, you have sort of like, I think, enormously productive, triumphant moments of interracial labor solidarity. And then when one of the factions, typically the centrist faction, enrolls an outside actor to basically influence the fight, that's when it gets ugly.
Yeah.
And it becomes fundamentally destructive.
Yeah. So, I was trying to think about the picture that I got of this competition. Because you're so good at describing how animating it was for the people involved, that despite the moments when they do tear each other down, in terms of advancing a program, I mean, so part of the reason that the organizing happened is because they're trying to generate support for their position, and they're trying to affirm their position,
right,
and things like that. So it's driving them to do lots of productive things, but it's not all charity that they're doing that. They're also doing it to win a sectarian struggle.
Right.
And what you show is that kind of competition, in a way, is actually quite generative, right? And so the Typographical Union is an excellent example, right?
Yeah.
And it is quite rare in contemporary labor.
Right.
But it was also rare in labor back then.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
And that generative nature seems to attract very talented people. It seems to motivate them to like figure out really interesting and energetic solutions to what they're confronting.
Yes.
And I kept coming away with that picture, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the most interesting example of that is the Negro American Labor Council, which organizes the March on Washington, because that is a coalitional organization. The left and the center are in the same organization, but the center leads. But if the center had led the entire time, then the March on Washington probably would never have happened.
Yeah.
Because what the Negro American Labor Council wanted to do was to influence George Meany and the AFL-CIO executive committee. George Meany was the president of the AFL-CIO for many years. And and they weren't moving the needle. Right? No, the AFL-CIO wasn't buckling under pressure. They were not making their locals desegregate. None of that business at all. And so the left inside the NALC says, oh, what's going on here? Are we going to hold a picket sign at any point? Are we going to fight? Are we going to make these people live up to their own stated values or what? And there's a lot of agitation about doing direct action and mass mobilization. And eventually it is because of that internal upward pressure on A. Philip Randolph that he goes to one of the most talented organizers in America at that time, Bayard Rustin, and says to him, well, what is it that we haven't done yet? I mean, I've been trying to get the AFL-CIO to do something. They haven't done anything. What haven't we done yet? And Bayard Rustin, who was an organizer in the Youth Communist League and was actually part of the original March on Washington movement in 1941, says, well, I suppose we haven't done a march yet. And so Randolph says to him, okay, interesting. Why don't you put together a proposal, and I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Randolph, who in your telling has been down that road of considering it a few times at that.
That's right, and has not at that point actually organized a March on Washington.
Yeah.
And then Rustin proposes the the sort of like organizing plan for the march, and Randolph goes along with it. And so, again, like we can't understand why the Negro American Labor Council organized the largest labor and civil rights demonstration at that time in American history without understanding the factional conflict, right, inside the NALC. Because I think Randolph probably would have just kept on trying to bang his head against a brick wall and try to get George Meany to desegregate American unions. But I think that the left made a crisis in the organization and said, this something needs to happen. We're dissatisfied here. Yeah.
So this is a reminder for those of you that are with us today to please put questions in the chat. We'll be turning to your questions relatively soon. Please contribute to the conversation. I'm sure Cedric would like to hear what's on your mind. Please put it in the chat, and we'll get to that shortly. Before we do, though, let's talk a little about the title of your book. Mm-hmm. Freedom Train, okay, which appears in particular in, as I mentioned to you when we were talking earlier, in a chapter that I think a lot of people might be inclined to skip over because mm-hmm. it's not about the heroic CIO moment.
Right.
And it's not about the heroic civil rights moment.
Right.
It's about the interregnum between the two, which in
right.
many ways was a fascinating story.
Yes.
But Freedom Train appears there as an idea that kind of summarizes an idea about what the struggle is.
Yes.
So there are a few things here. What were the people involved signifying with it? But then also a second question, which is, you chose that as the title of your book.
Yeah.
Drawing from the not heroic moment, but
right.
the quite embattled moment.
Sure.
And tell me a little about your thinking with that. But first, what were they signifying with this idea of Freedom Train? Right.
So the idea of calling this is the Freedom Train was the National Negro Labor Council, the NNLC, and the NNLC referred to themselves as the Freedom Train.
And so this is the left position.
This is the left independent black labor organization. It's run by Vicki Garvin of the Office Workers, Ernest Thompson, Big Train Thompson, who's from the UE. Coleman Young, who is from Wayne County CIO, and William R. Hood, who was the secretary of Local 600 UAWs, which represents all the workers at the River Rouge plant, the largest factory in the entire world, and the largest local in the entire country. Yeah. And they came up with this idea of the Freedom Train. And what did they mean by it? They wanted specifically to refer to the Underground Railroad, which smuggled the enslaved to freedom. They believed that all the kind of black organizations and the labor organizations up until that point had not fulfilled the promise of that emancipatory vision of black liberation. And that the NLC was going to do it. So they were finally going to be kind of they were going to be the Underground Railroad of that historical conjuncture.
Yeah.
It's super inspiring, and I mean, I chose it because I think even though we might be critical, and I don't really believe that I end up on either side, although I am a leftist myself, right? I I think that both factions of black labor saw themselves as the freedom train. That their objective was to desegregate the labor movement, which at that time meant desegregating the labor market, and at last opening the doors to you know to economic opportunity for black workers, doors that had been shut to them ever since the end of slavery. Right. So I think that both factions were committed to that vision. They differed on tactics and ideology and so forth, but I think that Freedom Train really summed up what all of black civil society was attempting to do.
Yeah. So I should note, you've used the term Black Civil Society a couple times, and
Sure.
you use it several times in the book, and it's
Yeah.
clearly, it's a little bit of a garbage can category.
Yeah.
So black politics has a specific meaning
Yes.
in your telling.
Yeah.
Black civil society is more of a contrasting garbage can for all the stuff that's out there, where people are gathering, organizing, talking, deliberating.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, when I think about black civil society, I think about black labor. I think about the clergy.
Right.
I think about all the political parties. I think about fraternal organizations, because actually fraternities and sororities play an important role throughout this book.
Yeah.
And artists and intellectuals. That for me is black civil society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, bringing it forward,
Yes.
We're in an interesting moment.
Yeah.
In terms of the labor movement and American society in general. There are very few heroic moments these days, unlike the moment that you're describing. We're also in a post-George Floyd moment, right, which I think was jarring for the labor movement in some places, although some places more than others. We're also post-Trump, which has also been very jarring for the labor movement in a number of ways. And I think one of the go-to questions that people might have would be, lessons of your book for the contemporary moment. But before you even get to that, I wonder how you feel about that inclination, because in some ways, while there are analogous things, black workers are still marginalized, they're still underrepresented in the labor movement, et cetera, right? White supremacy persists, class domination persists.
Right.
We're also in a moment when we are having debates as intellectuals on the left, which look remarkably similar to some of the debates that were happening in the 1920s.
Right.
But there's also whether that is actually what gets lost when we think about lessons for the moment, because in some ways some people do write that way. They write to mobilize historical scholarship to support a position in today.
Right.
Right. And I don't actually feel like that's what you're doing in this book. I think you are writing a work of history and historical sociology that is meant to recover a story which actually isn't reduced down to a bullet point or few that easily.
Right.
Although you do have 5.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So, let's think about the relationship between those sorts of reductions, but also let's talk about your 5.
Yeah.
And maybe other lessons that you see for the movie.
Yeah, sure. I think I want to take the beginning of that question first.
Okay.
And that is the lessons for the present moment. And I don't have any trouble doing that. I think that the reason why, one of the important reasons that history and historical sociology exists is so that we can engage not just with a kind of like our academic coworkers, but also to shape the future that we want to have. Right? I think that history is not about the past; it's about the future.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I would say if there's any lesson that I hope people will take from the book for the contemporary moment, it's that these black workers in Freedom Train established above ground organizations to confront in public, in the full light of day, the forces of fascism. And what I mean by that is the actual fascists, because that's who they were fighting, right? We're not talking about the descendants of the Axis powers, which we're talking about now, right? We're talking about the actual fascists, right? And in spite of just terrifying political repression and mass lynchings in this period, of Jim Crow, of the Solid South, and all of that, in spite of that, these black organizations stood on the front line and organized an effective and, I believe, a successful resistance to fascism. And I think that if they could do it, if the left and centrist factions of black labor could face fascism fully in the face and defeat it, then I think surely we, who stand on their shoulders and who have a world that is better, with more freedom, more access, more capacity, more institutional power than they ever would have dreamed of, that surely we can do the same.
That's interesting. So I want to remind people we are taking questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You have, I think it's the NNC, there's NNC meeting at Madison Square Garden.
Yes.
In the 1930s.
Yes.
I'm a native New Yorker.
Yes.
I care about my city. I also know that the Nazis were marching down 86th Street, which is the main commercial corridor in the neighborhood I grew up in the 1930s, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a German neighborhood.
Yeah.
Where I grew up is the site of a German brewery where they all worked. And there's, they're always and people want to tell the story about how America has always incubated either anti-intellectualism and Hofstadter's framing, or authoritarianism, or fascist elements, things like that, is always sort of an underlying stream in American life that connects the Klan to fascist elements in the 30s, et cetera, et cetera. That picture of the Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden always makes it into that narrative.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, sure.
Because it is the largest gathering, right?
Yeah.
Of Nazis in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
In a single meeting. And you're just telling this other story, and the NNC is right there in Madison Square Garden too.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that helps contextualize that a little bit. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that in particular, but that contrast immediately came to my mind.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a photograph. There are several photographs in the middle of the book about this time and about the different kind of like some more moments in the struggle for interracial labor solidarity. And there is a photo of an NNC rally. I believe it's actually in 1941 or 42, and it's packed. And the idea that an independent black labor organization could fill Madison Square Garden, and it was actually it was not just an NNC meeting.
Yeah.
The NNC had a wartime kind of organizing committee called the NLVC, the Negro Labor Victory Committee. That was an anti-fascist rally
Right.
at Madison Square Garden,
Yeah.
and the thing is packed. And by the way, it's not just like black intellectuals from the Renaissance,
Yeah.
right? It's sharecroppers. There's actually a floor view of the rally, and it's people in overalls. I mean, it's really it's the black masses. It's the black working class. They're all right there at this anti-fascist rally. So for those of us who say that, workers don't understand fascism, well, I got a picture to show you. So,
Well, and given that you had that very compelling connection to today, when you're talking about people who are relatively marginalized, don't seem to have a lot of power,
yeah.
able to take on the biggest political challenge to
Yeah.
defend democracy, but also workers and so on like that.
Yeah.
Any analogies that come to mind today?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Minneapolis, which is a case you know well, is talk about heroicism. I mean, and talk about standing up and facing fascism in the face and not shrinking from the challenge. I mean, and the thing is that we need to understand that is that fight, right, is certainly about the civil rights of people being trampled. It's certainly about immigrant rights, but that is also it's also a protest that is led in part by labor. And as we know, our comrade Marcia Howard, who's the president of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, is at the center of that struggle. Mm-hmm. Not only did she and her comrades hold down George Floyd Square, but in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, led 2 successful strikes, and is now at the center of leading this fight against ICE. And we're seeing it all over the country right now. People basically rising up and saying that this is not right. This is not the future that we want for ourselves or for our children, and it's not the future that working people deserve in this country. And I think that we are witnessing the formation, I think, and hope, of a new united front for the 21st century. Because not everybody there agrees, right? Marcia Howard is on the left of the labor movement, okay? Yeah. But there are people in the AFL-CIO who are also there who are supporting the general strike. There are members of both political parties involved, and there are a whole host of community organizations, and then just kind of like random individuals, folks from Minneapolis who are out in the street in the freezing cold weather, fighting this administration. And I think that, I would say that the people in this book would be proud of the people in Minneapolis and everybody else across this country who are taking up this fight.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's a fight worth winning.
And I think one thing to note about that, I appreciate what you just said, and if there were true justice in ending podcasts, we would have ended it right there, because that is an excellent place to end.
Uh-huh.
But one thing to note about this is that they're not confronting it by suing people in court.
Right.
They're not confronting it by trying to get the next promising politician elected.
Right.
So what are they doing?
They're engaging in direct action and mass mobilization. That is what they're doing. Look, the labor movement's strategy since 1936 has been to assimilate into the Democratic Party and integrate into the state power structure. That has been, and it remains the overarching strategy of the U.S. labor movement. Yeah. And the result of that is that we are not a direct action, mass mobilizing social movement anymore.
Absolutely.
And what this fight shows is that we need to revisit that strategy. Because if that strategy had worked, then we wouldn't have ICE out on the streets kidnapping people and throwing them behind the sun, right? I wouldn't be carrying my passport. My passport is in my backpack right now. I'm an American citizen, but you know what? It doesn't matter now, you know? And the thing is, right, is that if it mattered that I were a U.S. citizen, it would mean that we were in the midst of normal politics and that lobbying, legislation, assimilation of the Democratic Party, et cetera, was going to work in making the lives of working people better in this country. But it doesn't. It doesn't move the needle anymore. And the only thing that is not only going to stop the onslaught of fascism in this country and also revitalize the labor movement so that working people can have something, again, is if we do what is happening in Minneapolis and across the country.
Yeah. And I want to note here, you are not just a scholar of on-the-ground organizing. You are a scholar of parties.
Yes, right? That's right. Yeah.
So it's not that you're just taking a one-sided view on this. You have studied parties your whole career, right? So that form of politics is not uninteresting to you.
Right.
And you're not dismissive of it.
Right. No, absolutely.
But it is not the moment.
It's not the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So my colleague who leads the Center for Work and Democracy with me, Benjamin Fong, is in the chat.
Okay.
I'm going to briefly shout out a book called Rustin's Challenge, which he is about to publish.
Right.
It's coming out. It's out. It might actually be out. I think he would like to be in dialogue with you about Rustin, who of course is a major figure in getting the actual March on Washington, not all of the false starts, but the one that actually happens.
Yeah.
Organized, and maybe we could just have a little bit of a conversation about how you situate Rustin in the politics of the 1960s and the streams that you're describing of center versus left, so on like that, because I think he would be interested. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yes. Well, Rustin, like so many of the important figures in this book, travels across the political spectrum. He begins as a rank and file activist of the Youth Communist League, actually, and assists the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the March on Washington Committee of 1941 to mobilize tens of thousands of black people to go to Washington, D.C. And he is after that. I mean, he's arrested a few times because he's gay, and he was apprehended by the police for engaging supposedly in homosexual activity, to use a dated word, but pops out, in the middle of the 20th century at various points to help strategize. So he was an early architect with Dr. King in thinking about the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And then resurfaces again. He's a pacifist throughout this entire time, but when Randolph reaches out to him for the March on Washington in 1963, he's working for A.J. Musty, right, who is a well-known pacifist, is talking about nuclear weapons, and this is what he does. A lot of his writing, Rustin's writing, is actually about military aggression in this period. And then Randolph poaches him from A.J. Musty, who is not too happy about that, because he's super talented and a brilliant mind. And he organizes. He's basically the strategic mastermind behind the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I mean, to bring 250,000 people to Washington D.C. in that period, I mean, it's a gargantuan task now.
Yeah.
But back then, it was basically impossible, and nobody thought he could do it.
Yeah.
But he did it. So he's like our equivalent of like like a Genghis Khan or a Hannibal. Like he's like
That seems much more bloodthirsty.
no, well he knows. So right, excuse me, but a brilliant strategist, incredible, just absolutely incredible. But then once the civil rights movement and the NALC are able to basically help desegregate the labor movement, and you have the Civil Rights Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, he becomes entrenched in the mainstream of the AFL-CIO. He's the president, actually, of what is called the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which is basically still a constituency group inside the AFL-CIO. And from that position, actually ends up criticizing the black left for their kind of like nationalistic, anti-pacifistic kind of like tendencies in the Black Power movement, in drum and other sort of like political formations in the black community. So he travels all the way from the farthest left to basically the center of the center in that period.
So I'm going to ask one more question.
Sure.
And then we're going to wrap. And this also comes from Ben.
Oh, okay.
So Ben is making an argument that Randolph is of the left, but gets dinged for being centrist because he's an organizational leader. So Ben's asking a question about whether if you end up having to engage in institutional politics, whether that automatically paints you as centrist. And I don't think that's actually what you're arguing.
Right.
And I don't think you're falling into that kind of trap.
Right.
But it does go to the question, which is sometimes when people engage in organizational leadership or institutional politics at all, they often get painted as sellouts or inappropriately radical or whatever.
Right.
So in terms of your understanding of Randolph, how would you sort of,
Randolph is a socialist, and I make no bones about that. I mean, he's a central member of the Socialist Party in Harlem, and as I said earlier, he really believes that the Socialist Party is a home for black people in this country. But he gets dinged for being a centrist for real concrete reasons. When he and Frank Crossway found the Negro Labor Committee USA,
right.
I mean, they did some really nasty stuff. I think they betrayed their brothers and sisters on the left, people who they had worked with before. Both Crossway and Randolph, and I think conspired with the white-led mainstream labor movement and the state to politically persecute the left. And so I'm not doing it gratuitously. I'm not putting him in the center, just because he's willing to be a member of the executive committee of the AFL and later the AFL-CIO. I call him a centrist because the center, what is common to the centrist faction across time is that they vacillate. They're willing to work in coalition with the left sometimes, and then they can pivot and become outright red baiters, at another historical conjuncture. That's why they get paid. That's why I peg them as centrists, is because they've got this kind of like weird, they can swing, in seemingly impossible directions, given Randolph's, biography as a socialist. I believe I believe that he believes that he's still a socialist when he dies, and I will take him at his word for that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy. The scholar is Cedric de Leon, professor of sociology at UMass Amherst, and the book is Freedom Train: Black Politics and the Story of Interracial Labor Solidarity. Thank you for being with us today.